it's very difficult to schedule a Zoom meeting at 6:15. It's either 6 or 6:30. So
we can start with the
yeah. Okay. So welcome all to our fourth session of this senior seminar series on Muslim prophetology. It is our pleasure to have today the first guest who is presenting in person, Dr. Michele Petrone. Welcome, Michele, to Tübingen. I'm particularly pleased to know that it's the first time that Michele is visiting Tübingen, and I hope there will be many more. In few words in terms of introduction, Dr. Michele Petrone, he earned his PhD from University of Naples in 2013. And he is currently a research fellow at L'Orientale in Naples and a member of the European Quran ERC research project. His research focuses on circulation and interaction of manuscripts with a focus on the role played by readers and users of manuscripts. The title of his presentation today is Love and Jurisprudence in the Exclusive Characteristics of the Prophet, what are called the Khasais and Nabawiyya. Michele, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks to Professor Vimercati for inviting me, to Besnik and Zainab for helping me being physically here, because it was not that easy. And thank you for coming both in presence and online. And I'm particularly grateful for being invited in this context, talking about prophetology, because this allows me to wrap up some sparse threads, namely those of prayer on the Prophet and Khasais, which I've been working on, but I never had the occasion to put the two things together. Today's topic would be a bit challenging, maybe boring. So stop me if I'm boring you to death, please. Because we will explore two genres of Arabic religious literature, or Islamic literature, if you prefer it, in parallel. The first, not in order, because we will start with Khasais, but we start, prayer on the Prophet should be more familiar to all of us. I mean, the expression Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is common to all Muslims. So it's not something strange in its most basic form. The second, Khasais, maybe it requires a first introduction before delving into details. The word Khasasa occurs only 4 times in the Quran. As you can see from the slide, choice, the meaning choice or being chosen, is coupled with giving preference. But the aspect of this root that prevailed in the terminology of Hadith literature, of which we were dealing with today, is the one of exclusivity. In Hadith literature, especially in those collections gathering materials relevant for jurisprudence, the term indicates any legal provision that is applicable to a specific individual or group. More precisely, Khasais Nabawiyya are in origin the legal provisions that apply only to the Prophet Muhammad. These, as it may be evident, represent only a tiny minority of the whole fiqh corpus, also if we consider the most essential norms of fiqh. One of the earliest attestations of the topic can be found already in Shafi'i's Kitab al-Umm, when God the Most High chose Muhammad for his revelation, wahi, and made clear which were the duties of his creatures obeying him, made incumbent on the Prophet some acts which were not compulsory for his creatures to increase the nearness of the Prophet to him, and made lawful to him things that he prohibited, he should make capital, sorry, to his creatures. In this passage, Ash-Shafi'i lays the foundations for further discussion in the following centuries. I have to say that this is quoted by Al-Muzani in some editions of the Kitab al-Umm. This is not present, which is a curious thing. I've not delved into this philological detail, but it needs some inquiries. There is an initial subdivision of the acts in two categories: obligations and concessions, permissions. What are bestowed on him as a form of grace, a favor that is embodied in the possibility of bearing a heavier burden than every other believer. The two categories of obligation and permission constitute the backbone of every other discussion in the field of chasais, although related mainly to the question of having more than 4 wives at the same time, and the status of Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, the mothers of the believers, who are prohibited to remarry because of their status of mothers of all believers acquired by marrying the Prophet. In 5th, 6th century of the Hijrah, 11th century of Christian calendar, the discussion of chasais is anyway almost completely focused on the legal side. Authors such as al-Bahyaqi, we will not touch every author. There are tens of them, and so we don't have time. We need a course on chasais. Anyway, almost completely focused al-Bahyaqi on legal provisions. Also, they do not provide Bahyaqi and others any definition of the term, giving it for granted. And also, the expression they use is most frequently Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala khassa nabi bi something, and he characterized, chose him, preferred him with this feature, assigned to him exclusively this legal provision. This does not imply a technical meaning attributed to the root khasasa, but simply its use in legal discourse to identify some very specific norms that apply only to Muhammad. The fact that the first discussion of khasais Nabawiyya happened in a Shafi'i context and its consequences. The most important is that almost all the works we will see today are from authors belonging to this juridical school. Outside the Shafi'i environment, we find the Kitab al-Shifa of al-Qadiyat. I have an expert here, so I'm quite embarrassed, but it's just few notes. He was Qadiyat was a Maliki jurist, and he approached the question from a different point of view, namely the one of miracles. In fact, in his Kitab al-Shifa, al-Qadiyat did not mention in the section devoted to the chasais any of the legal provisions analyzed by earlier authors, Shafi authors. For him, what distinguishes the Prophet and the favor Allah bestowed on him are his mu'jizat, his miracles, that belong only to him and could be performed only by him due to the special relation he had with God. This epistemological framework is here essentially divergent from the one of the Shafis. And the fact that he was a jurist played a role in indirectly determining the irrelevance in the Maliki environment of legal chasais in defining the unicity of Muhammad amongst humankind. But this is at least for Malikis. Let us move to the other rail of our discussion, namely prayer of the Prophet. What was happening in this period? So 11th, 12th century, which texts were written or discussed about prayer on the Prophet? Well, the emergence of Tasliyah, praying on the Prophet as a practice, is of course not limited to a single area or to a specific madhab. Nonetheless, it is undeniable that the western part of the Islamic world has seen a more articulated development of the genre. Tracing the early stages of Tasliyah composition and collection as a genre is more difficult than it has been with chasais. Prayer on the Prophet as a practice is attested in Hadith literature, mainly in the various forms of the Salatul Ibrahimiyya, used mainly during ritual prayer. The legitimacy of the practice of praying on the Prophet is out of discussion, even in early sources, as the exhortation in the Quranic verse in Allah wa malaikatu yusalluna ala nabi clears the field from any doubt about the legitimacy of praying. But merits and modalities of this practice can be and have been discussed by ulama since the 3rd, 9th century. Most important, some texts discuss newly found or simply composed forms of prayer. If praying on the Prophet is legitimate, and meritorious, the formulation of new modalities of prayer is subject to a progressively growing inquiry. The process of legitimation is gradual and starts already in the 13th century, as we have seen, with authors like Ad-Dahak or Al-Azdi, who introduced already some forms based on the Salatul Ummiyya, which is not attested in the main collections of Hadith. Here you can see the form, Allahumma salli ala nabiyyil ummi, with some mixing with the Salatul al-Ibrahimiyya. The choice of focusing only on texts by jurists, or more generally ulama, is due to the lack of evidence of discussion of prayer on the Prophet by early Sufis. Works like Kitab al-Lum'a of As-Sarraj do not mention Tasliya at all. If we take slightly later ones, like the Hilat al-Awliya, an enormous work on biographies of early Sufis, we find very few incidental mentions of prayer on the Prophet, like when you pray on the Prophet, make your prayer beautiful, without any direct reference to a specific form or modality. Although scanty, this reference already implies the possibility of composing new prayers on the Prophet. So choosing the works of authors who were primarily experts in Hadith, and only secondarily, in some cases, affiliated to a Sufi order, was then compulsory, because we have no sources prior to the 11th, 12th century dealing properly with prayer on the Prophet as a form of composition, not as a practice or individual practice. It also allows us to explore an intellectual and spiritual space that has been too often overshadowed by the specialization of Islamic studies that has separated Sufis from their intellectual milieu on one side, and on the other side, has made them more speculative than they were. The first work to devote a chapter on the diverse modalities of Tasliya, disregarding the question of legitimacy, and allowing new composed forms, is the Kitab al-Qurma Rabb al-Alamin. Its author, Ibn Bashkwal, is mainly known as a historian of Al-Andalus, where he spent all his life. His Kitab al-Sila is still a fundamental reference for the history of ulama of Al-Andalus up to the 12th century. He wrote a collection of stories of pious men who saw their invocation accepted by God, the Kitab al-Mustaghithina Billah, including the formulas they used. The Kitab al-Qurba can be ascribed to the same pietistic vein. Ibn Bashkwal aimed at collecting texts that could help Muslims in their devotional practices without any explicit or implicit tie with Sufism. He even did not mention Ibn Barajan in his Kitab al-Sira, although they shared some students and they have met. So it was not actually a Sufi. Or if he had ties with Sufi, they were not with the current of Ibn Barajan. So we can find forms of prayer quite complex, like this one. You can read it here. This, as other prayers in this collection, have a marked metaphysical imprint that transposes aspects of the figure of Muhammad being the seal of prophecy, in this case, to a supersensible and ontological level. So this is a first shift in the history, because we have a collection of prayers on the Prophet, a collection that, although it was not Sufi, it was reporting prayers that possibly were recited by Sufi, reported by a historian, a Hadith scholar. But Ibn Bashkwal is also a fundamental figure because he was the master of the order of the first work solely devoted on Khasa'is, written by Al-Hafiz Ibn Dihya al-Kalbi, and the text is Nihayat al-Sul fi Khasa'is al-Rasul, the ultimate petition about the exclusive features of the messengers. The Hafiz Ibn Dihya was, according to Ibn Khalikan, an Andalusi traditionist who traveled the Islamic world to collect the best isnads and new hadith. He ended up in Cairo, where he died in 1235. He is mainly known for his Mawlid book, Kitab al-Tanwir fi Mawlid al-Siraj al-Munir. It was composed in Erbil for the Sultan Muzaffar, who allegedly gifted Ibn Dihya with 1,000 golden dirham. This is in a way scholarly book. that has little in common in the form and in the content with later mawlids, like the one of Al-Barzanji, which are chanted and recited still nowadays. Most of the text is busy with Ilm al-Ansab genealogies, and the account of the birth of the Prophet is a series of akhbar with all this isnad and the discussion of the reliability of the isnad. So it's not something that you should recite. It also contains a small section on khasais that are not organized according to any form of criterion. They span from marriage to miracles without any order. It is anyway noteworthy that Ibn Yahya already considered the topic before moving to Egypt and composing his Nihayat al-Sur. The interaction with Shafi'i jurists probably led him to reconsider the materials that were scattered in the Tanwir. But as it is evident from the very introduction of the Nihaya that you can see here, the framework has evolved significantly. And prayer, peace be upon Muhammad, his prophet and trustee of his inspiration, was being given exclusive characters or features that elevated his degrees and made his miracles shine. I will mention in this book some of the exclusive features of the messenger that have never been reunited before in any creature, and the rights that Allah granted him and not to any other creature. There are two relevant novelties. The reference to miracles that significantly expands the domain of khasais, and which were already present in the Mawlid, and the comparison with other creatures, to which is also devoted a specific section. This last point introduces a feature of khasais literature that is rooted in jurisprudence, but sees here a new development in the direction of the definition of the figure of Muhammad as absolutely exceptional, not only from the point of view of Sharia. This represents a further specification of the distinction made at the beginning of his work, focused on legal matters and on Ummah. The Prophet is not only exceptional because of revelation or miracle, but also miracles, but also for his personal and individual status during his life. This distinction was further elaborated by other authors of the Mamluk period that we have not the time to deal with. It is Izz-ad-Din ibn Abd Salam, Ibn al-Murakin, and al-Khaydari. But it is noteworthy that the titles of the works of Abd Salam and Ibn al-Murakin resembled the one of Ibn Yahya, because they were writing something thinking as a continuity, expanding, which is a tendency typical of the Mamluk period of expanding previous work, looking for new traditions and showing up that I know more than other authors. There was a huge competition. There's an article by Carl Petrie about this phenomenon. To better understand this passage, it is worth giving a first look at the most influential author of the genre of khasais, our friend Jalaluddin as-Suyuti. He composed two main works, but in fact there are four, on khasais. The Kifayatul Labib fi Khasais al-Habib, known also as Khasais al-Kubra, and as-Sughra, the smaller ones, known as Al-Mudaj al-Labib fi Khasais al-Habib, the understandable pattern in the exclusive features of the beloved. More than the former, which is an enormous encyclopedia on the Prophet, it is the latter, shorter work that influenced the destiny of this genre. The Mudaj is a dry, succinct work organized around a rigid subdivision. As you can see here, we have distinguished Muhammad from other prophets in his essence, in this word, in his community, in this word. So there is what distinguishes him and what distinguishes him from his community. Then in the Akhirah, in the other word, the same distinctions. Then as-Suyuti acknowledges that there are some khasais that are of the Prophet, but were already present in a minor form in previous prophets. Then it moves to the legal part, what is fard, what is haram, what is mubah, obligatory, prohibited, illicit, and karamat and fada'il, which is the closing section. The all-encompassing nature of this compendium, which is 100 pages long, but it is incredibly dense, it made its fortune. It touches all the essential points of the figure of the prophet in 100 pages, spanning from marriage and wives to the difference between prophet and saint in the matter of knowledge, certainty, yaqeen, and miracles, and from the obligation of complete ablution on Friday to the compulsory nature of tazliyah at the end of ritual prayer, because it is a khasisa of the prophet. So it is the framework of interpretation that changes. This is just normal act, but for As-Suyuti and also already for Ibn Dihya, this is a khasisa of the prophet. No other prophet had this before, and it is exclusive of him. So it is the framework of interpretation of the act that is changing and allows the expansion of this genre. And here I can give you another quick glimpse of the text that shows how far we have moved from Kitab al-Umm. It's only rubber because what matters are the names. As-Suyuti, as Sufi himself, not surprisingly quotes Ibn Atala al-Iskandari, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, al-Yafi, three Sufis of different periods and areas, but never engages in the Mudaj al-Abid, or in the Khasas al-Kubra with the topic of modalities of prayers on the Prophet. Is focused on the Prophet only. So it's not the tasliyah that matters to him. He did not even devote a specific work. He wrote 500 works. So he had time, possibility to write on tasliyah. Although he wrote a fundamental manual on the possibility of vision of the Prophet while awake the It is noteworthy that the tasliyah is also incidentally addressed in the emotion among the khasais that distinguish Muhammad from the other prophets, but no merits are mentioned. This is the tasliyah at the end of the project, at the end of ritual prayer is mentioned. It is a khasisa, but there is no merit. It does not mention the merits, so it is completely outside the boundaries of the literature on tasliyah. The Mozaj is not the last text about khasais, but there is a development. We here we have Ibn Tulun, who was a disciple of As-Suyuti. We have other Al-Munawi, who was a disciple of As-Suyuti and commented on the khasais. But the only trait in common among them is that they had faint ties with Sufism, or they were not Sufis at all. And also, if they were Sufis, they were referring, as As-Suyuti did in this case, to legal texts, like this fatwa from Nukat al-Hawi of al-Nashri. It is not the content that matters here. What matters is that As-Suyuti is reading this tradition. It is transmitted from him that he did not pray on his son Ibrahim. Some ulama say it is because his father's prophethood made the prayer unnecessary, as it is for martyrs. It is the framework of interpretation of this, which is, it is a khasisa that it is also transmitted to Ibrahim ibn Muhammad, the son of the prophet. So the framework of interpretation is not that, yes, it is legal, simply some legal provisions. It is everything concerning the figure of Muhammad that is going to be not only characterize him, but also his progeny. Following this path of development, although in diverse ways, literature of Khasaisim works on merits of Tasliyah significantly evolved until the formal end of Mamluk power in Egypt and Syria, 1517. As-Suyuti died 1505, and we see that this is a crucial period in the development of this genre. In the Mamluk period, Sufi authors became more organized around tekkes or zawiyas, if you prefer, and institutions financed by Mamluk waqfs. This process of diffusion and institutionalization that had its peak at the beginning of the 16th century can be considered among the causes of the devotional shift of the two genres that we are exploring. In this period, it is the period where Nuruddin Ashuni, one of the masters of Abd al-Wahhab al-Sha'rani, famous Sufi, established in Cairo the practice of night vigils reciting prayer on the Prophet, the Laylatul Mahya. Such occasions probably multiplied quickly, and the practice of collective dhikr based on prayer on the Prophet was popularized, as demonstrated also by the polemics about Mawlids. We have no time to act this way, but it would be interesting to still dig into the text about Mawlid. This popularization of Tasliyah was prepared by a number of works on the merit and the forms of prayer on the Prophet. We have not the time to explore all these works like the ones of Al-Firuzabadi, Al-Wanshari, Ibn al-Jawzi, and more and more. They were all scholars with or without ties with Sufism, but they wrote works on prayer on the Prophet. I will focus just on one figure, one of the many arch enemies of Suyuti, academically speaking, who wrote Al-Qawl al-Badi fi Salat al-Habib al-Shafi. It is basically a work on merits of Tasliyah, but built with the composition of prayers in mind. As-Sakhawi provides the reader with a word-by-word commentary of prayers circulating at the time. This approach has two advantages. First, As-Sakhawi builds a collection of prayers, although scholarly fashions, commented word by word. He is, as we will see, constructing new prayers. The commentary helps future readers to build new prayers starting from the bricks he has explained and organized. As-Sakhawi comments every aspect of the Tasliyah, from the wording to the occasion to the merits of every single prayer in its form, and obviously the terminology. And let's read this passage. And if we say, "Oh God, send your blessings on Muhammad, Barik," its meaning is, "Oh God, make the mention of Muhammad perpetual, and do so for his call to Islam and his law, and make abundant his followers and groups that follow him," and so on and so on. Here, after explaining the quite elusive meaning of barakah, commenting the word barik, using the tasliyah at the end of ritual prayer, the Salatul Ibrahimiyya, As-Sakhawi produces a new prayer that, although it was not probably recited, is a sample, a collection of samples for future authors. These are probably the reasons behind the enormous success of the Qawl al-Badi that practically closed the genre of Fadal Nabi up to, I have to say, late 19th century, early 20th century with Yusuf Nabhani, which is, but we are in a completely different environment, in a completely different figure. We know, anyway, that later authors used this as a model, as a template for their prayers. And it is, Al-Qawl al-Badi is quoted by all later Sufis, not only from Egypt, but from Morocco up to 18th century, West Africa, even in Ethiopia, is quoted as an author who explains how prayer on the Prophet works. So this is possibly the most important work on Fadal Salawat Nabi from the point of view of the history of the genre. This work is the peak of this genre, and most important, is a first form of collection of prayers. As-Sakhawi had Sufi masters, as demonstrated by Alberi in his studies of As-Sakhawi's Ijaza, but chose to produce a scholarly work on Tasliyah. So he did not write a collection to be recited. He acted as a scholar. What is more interesting to us here is that it is not the metaphysical, theological, or general doctrinal part that is essential in this work. although it is clearly detectable. As-Sakhawi focuses on the practical issues of composing a prayer, reciting it, and understanding its meaning. It has more to do with the groups reciting Tanzliya at night than with the ontological nature of the Muhammadi, of the figure of the Prophet. To conclude this presentation, I would like to first mention the work of a beloved figure with Aisha al-Ba'uniya, who composed a Sufi versification of a Suyuti's Umad. This poem the poem is called Durar al-Ghais fi Bahr al-Mu'jizat wal-Khasais, and is extant in a single manuscript from Cairo. I have to thank the Professor Hammer, who recently passed away, for providing me with this manuscript. Aisha al-Ba'uniya was a Sufi from Damascus, a scholar of Hadith, a disciple of the Urmawi Qadiri Sufi order. She moved to Cairo to pursue her studies and follow her mystical path. She literally fell in love with the Mutajjalabid. She says, "Shuriftu," and decided to put it in, as she says, I have no quotation of the verse, but I'll read it. A poem that will be a delight to hear, becoming easy and simple for people to memorize. The text is also organized according to the same categories found in the Mutaj. Here you can see, it did not keep the redlining, but you can see here, وَمِمَّا بِي اخْتَصَّ فِي أُمَّةٍ لَهُ بِآخِرَةٍ وَمِمَّا بِي اخْتَصَّ مِنْ جُمْلَةِ الْفَضَائِلِ. So what distinguishes the Prophet in his community in the hereafter, and what distinguishes the Prophet in his merits and what is being granted to him by God, Takrim. Almost half of the poem is devoted anyway to miracles and signs, ayat. The series at a certain point quite dry, so because it is a didactic poem, includes all the features of the Prophet mentioned in the Mud, approximately in the same order. The text itself is then nothing more than a didactic poem, but when reading the Mujaj, she witnessed something like a glimpse of light coming from the sun, and a ray from the noon, from the eye without sight. Thus the Lord granted me to make a complete precise with terse words, so who sees them will understand their goal. And he can unveil my secret and bring me close to majesty, come from his self-disclosures, tajalliyat, and attract me away from myself to him with his favor, through him veiling me from creation and mankind. The premises, so this is in the introduction, and the premises to the work have completely changed here. The aim is not anymore juridical, but essentially spiritual, if not purely mystical, out of a love that derives from the very same alterity, the exceptionality that Ibn Dihya had identified in his khasais. In the Dur al-Ghais, however, this alterity is not overcome. Al-Ba'uniya goes in the direction of the annihilation of her individuality in the presence of God. The union with the Prophet, or even getting closer to him as the peak of spiritual experience that is part of the Sufi tradition, starting from the 17th century, is not in the notion of so-called, okay, maybe it's me.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. And it is present in the 17th century Sufi tradition as part of mystical, as the peak of mystical, as the annihilation in the messenger of God. There are two important articles, one by Ratke and one by Udaminio Gunaiker about this this process. But this led this direction. If Ba'uniya takes the path of God, not the path of the Prophet, which, well, are the same, but not exactly the same. On the mystical path, let me try this one.
Just continue. I will try something.
It's taken by, in the same period, by in Tunisia, it's taken by Ibn Azum al-Qayrawani. He was born in a family of pious jurists, a family that is a family of jurists still nowadays. Okay, so you can see, well, you can still understand what's happening. But he was not Sufi. His family had and has not any tie with Sufism in any form. Even they are not attached to a local saint or to a mosque where a local saint is buried. In the introduction to the Istanbul Anam, which is a collection of some 5,300 prayers on the Prophet, he says that he read several thousand books, hadith books, to compose his work. That, as Dor al-Ghais, is a compendium, a mukhtasar of books about the Prophet. The work had an immediate success, as we find luxury. Another one. Luxury copies starting from 35 years after his death, like this one of the 10th century Hijra from the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, which is a beautiful copy also because it has colored pages. So you have purple, green pages, and is gilded. So it's written in gold. Most the titles, what is in yellow, it is actually gold. So it is really a luxury copy. It's not something that you write by yourself. You need a professional to do this, and you need a lot of money. And I stumbled upon this because I've been working in Ethiopia, and in Ethiopia, working on Islamic manuscripts there, you can find in every house of a pious Muslim, maybe you won't find a Quran, sure, but there is a copy of Tanbih al-Anam. And wealthy families gift it on wedding when forming a new family. And it is recited during funerals, it is reciting during marriage, childbirth. So it is a fundamental text and gave birth to a series of derived texts. So this is why I ended up working on this text. But from a textual point of view, the Tanbih has some chapters devoted to the Khasais. Go on. Put in form of prayer on the Prophet. The first part of the first chapter of the Tanbih devoted to exclusive features of Muhammad is following almost the same path as As-Suyuti Sunnah, namely the chapter on was it exclusive to him in the hereafter, like the following that you can see here. You can read في خصائص الفردية ومواهب الأولية, and then you can see it's almost cut, sorry, by PowerPoint, but the form of the prayer is Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa sallim ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad. So it is, this is the form, and all the 5,000 prayers are built in this form. This is the beginning, and then he adds a bit of text, a word, some words, in this case based on khasais. I've included this section because the last prayer deals with the earth opening on the day of resurrection from Muhammad's head, literally the skull, Junjumatihi. It is said here that is attested already in the Musnad of Ibn Hanbal and in the works of Khasais like the Khasais al-Kubra of As-Suyuti. This, and it gave birth also to stories about Jesus and the skull, and Jesus. It's a complex line. The presence of skulls and skulls speaking. It is interesting. Roberto Totoli wrote something about this, but it is also interesting. This first section is followed by a miscellaneous one in which the otherworldly features are still predominant, but mixed with physical or even jurisprudential ones, almost all characterized by the feature of awwaliyya, being the first to do or get a certain benefit. Despite this, Ibn Azum seems to have followed his own inspiration without a clear organization in mind. Some khasais can be found in other sections devoted to Mawlid or even to Sirah. Literary re-elaboration of the various khasais and the tendency to reprise the same khasisa with a different word make difficult to building an exact correspondence between this text and Moses Jalabid, Khasais al-Kubra, and other texts of the book. Ibn Azum refers to books on traditions about the Prophet without mentioning any title. His aim, as for Bawniya, is to make prayers easy to memorize and to recite, and as he declared in the introduction of the work. Both texts, although in different ways, responded to an exigency that was present in their social environments. He even says, and I wrote this according to Ikhtisar was according to the forms of abridgment of preachers. But most important, I wrote this so voices will ascend through these prayers in sessions of dhikr, majalis. So it was expressively written for majalis al-dhikr. But in its essence, it is a scholarly work about the Prophet based on 3 minutes. The process of reelaboration and popularization of traditions that were buried in Hadith collections, Sirah, and Maghazi texts happened through the composition of devotional literature written by ulama more or less involved with institutionalized Sufism. In this perspective, Ibn Azum followed a similar path as the one adopted by As-Suyuti in writing his works on khasais, exploring prophetic traditions, looking for materials that would serve as a basis for the composition of a text about the Prophet. If As-Suyuti did not compose a devotional text, Al-Bawniya made one from his homage. Ibn Azum took a more direct path, transforming traditions into prayers, aiming at the gatherings that were already held in mosques, but not being explicitly Sufi, as shown by Nelly Amri in Tunisia, that there were gatherings of prayers on the Prophet, which were open to all people, not to people linked to a specific tariqa or to a specific saint. So they were simply open. Getting to conclusions, we've seen how at the end of 15th century, primarily in Egypt, texts about the exclusive features of the Prophet became more popular and finally were used as a basis for devotional literature. This passage may appear obvious. On what should a poet or a Sufi base his works on the Prophet or other than prophetic traditions? I mean, that's it. Is not the Burda of Busiri written in the 13th century a work on the figure of the Prophet? But the Burda, as the Dalal al-Khairat, composed almost 1 century later, were composed by Sufis. Al-Busiri was a disciple of Abu Abbas al-Mursi. Al-Jazuli was a Sufi master himself. For Sufis, not for the general public. They were written in parallel with the evolution of khasais literature from jurisprudence to devotion, although in a form that fits the formal boundaries of medieval Islamic scholarship. The Prophet was put at the center of attention in all areas, giving birth to interactions between domains that only Western scholarship has considered as separated. We've seen diverse tendencies and threads interact. Khasais works in 13th century started to abandon the focus of on jurisprudential aspects to focus more on the exceptionality of the Prophet and the points marking his difference from his community from the other prophets, and more generally from humankind. In this process, the relation between Ibn Bashwal and Ibn Dihya is noteworthy because it connects directly the tradition of writing about prayer on the Prophet by a scholar and writing Khasais by his disciple, putting at the center not the figure of the Prophet as simply the bearer of revelation, but as an exception in creation. Khasais works in the same period started, the case of the Umuda Jalabib becoming the basis for a Sufi poem represent the appropriation of scholarly literature about Muhammad by Sufis who did rely on works specifically devoted to the exaltation of the Prophet. Finally, the Tanbih al-Anam, but also other works like the Khamsamiya Salawat wa Rassas, sees an alim that is composing a collection of praise on the Prophet and not a book of Sufi Azkar, based on the same traditions collected in Khasais books, and even using the letter as a category to subdivide this book. There is still a lot of work to be done to conclusively demonstrate how the figure of the Prophet became more and more central to the intellectual environment outside or on the fringe of Sufi orders. Reprising a work of Claude Hadas of a few years ago, we worked on the works of Al-Jili, of Muhammad Wafa, and others that focused on the figure of the Prophet from a metaphysical point of view. These works were not isolated, not the result of an individual effort or attachment to the Prophet, but they were and are part of a larger spiritual and intellectual movement that involved the entirety of Muslim societies. Ulama were part of this movement and expressed their love for Muhammad with their means, which, despite their apparent dryness, have proved to inspire texts and actions of pious devotion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele. I just wanted to write specifically about the people who are joining via Zoom, that you can use the chat room to ask your questions, or you can otherwise unmute yourself and you can ask your question. It would be nice if you can introduce yourself shortly. At the same time, people here in the room can think of your questions. And Ruggero, would you want to?
That's okay, I begin with. Thank you very much, Michele, for this very interesting presentation, also graphically, and we were allowed to dive into manuscripts from many periods and regions. My question was, or is, also related to what we are doing here, and somehow, in some sense, and the question of theology, and that would be, what, according to you, or according to the sources, in your reading of the sources, let's say, what do the Khasais actually mean for the believer? Or, this exceptionality of the Prophet, which is, let's say, an element of prophetology, of theology, of a certain conception of the Prophet. But what would it mean, for the religious life of the believer? What is the significance?
Thank you for this challenging question, because it's well, first of all, if we see that, I just touched upon diverse aspects of a long textual tradition, and there are two aspects that emerge. The first is purely legal. There are some legal provisions, some ahkam that are exclusive of the Prophet. So practically, the believer in his daily life is faced with something that he can do and the Prophet can't do, or even that something that the Prophet must do and this is for him only a sunnah, let's say the Salat al-Witr, for instance. So this is a ritual, practical relation. But I hope that I have been able to show you that this practical ritual, this distance, becomes even more deep with the elaboration of the genre of Hassais. I talk about literary genres, but it is a spiritual movement, an intellectual, an evolution of how the society perceived the Prophet. So becoming deeper and deeper, it is the figure of the Prophet that becomes this distant. I would not say, as I've read recently, that it is because the Prophet is distant, it becomes distant in time. And so it also becomes distant and completely or almost completely other. I would not agree on this diachronic, because what happens actually is that this distance is overcome by making him even more present through prayer on the Prophet, Hassais, focus on the Prophet. And it's not only Hassais, it's Shamail, Dalail, Maulid, and every other form of literature that you can imagine that are only focused on him. So if there is a distance in time, this distance is completely overcome. So for the believer, is making him even more present, not only in his daily practical life, but also interiorized as something other, but that you can connect with.
Don't you think, if I may just
Of course.
add something, a question, don't you think that at the beginning you were talking about the election? I mean, this is in the word itself, you know, of Hassais, of Khususiyya, and but it's an expression, I mean, in some sense, as far as I understood it, this Hassais, of the fact of the unique election of which the Prophet is the object. Divine elect, they worked out this prophet, that even if, as you say, there's a distance which you cannot, I mean, abolish, of course, he, in some sense, or he or she, benefits from this unique election, in some sense, okay, through the connection, okay, through the tasliya and other forms of connection. So this election, which is an expression of divine favor, you know, of a specific favor conceded to the Prophet Muhammad and to his community through him, the believer is, you know, benefits from this and has, you know, participates in this divine favor which God, you know, concedes to the Prophet in this unique way. So there's, wouldn't you say there's something like this also in it?
Yes, but one has to consider that before the end of Mamluk period, most of the works of Hassais, and also for large part tasliyas, which were tasliyas were accessible to a limited number of people. In the first case, ulama, fuqaha mainly. In the second case, people who were part of Sufi orders. With the popularization, I really don't like this term, but I can find any better word. But if you have one, please suggest it to me. But the popularization of Sufism and the institutionalization of Sufism, it's this form of becoming closer to the Prophet becomes accessible to a larger audience. But there is another element in what you say. This is the favor of God to the Prophet. But there is also element of comparison with other prophets, which are obviously part of Muslim religion and prophetology in general, but it is a mean of putting the prophet at the center, not only of the believer's life, not only of the life of Muslim community, but of humankind in general. There is the distinction between what legal provisions are exclusive for of the prophet and not for Muslims, but shared by other prophets, entails another dimension of distinction, but it is also encompassing a development that I see in this kind of literature, mainly in Eastern Africa, but also in West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, so Ethiopia or Senegal or Nigeria, starting from the 19th century, is that these poems like the Ashraniyat of Al-Fazazi or other works on other collections of prayer of the Prophet are a didactic mean. So they teach about the Prophet Muhammad, reciting about prophetology, about the history of Prophet. So this kind of approach to the figure of the Prophet as an exclusive figure in history is not building up any form of distance. It is becoming more and more at the core of every form of teaching prophetology focused on Muhammad, teaching Salat and what you should not do during Salat, or you must do during Salat, through this means. So it is essential at the core of the experience.
What you were just saying reminded me there are works in anthropology of religion in Egypt, in contemporary Egypt, that emphasizes this aspect that the teachings of the Shama'il, in particular of the qualities and the descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ, become are part of a conception of embedding the qualities of the Prophet. So the idea of kind of the prophetic presence becomes permeated in a way in the community. If I could kind of throw the next question before we get others, you kind of spoke about this idea of the literature of the Khasa'is kind of putting the Prophet apart from other prophets. But I want to bring the conversation to the aspect of Isma, or the infallibility, which in a way Muslim prophetology believes that it is a shared characteristic of all the prophets. So I was wondering, based on the sources that you are looking, but also in particular Suyuti and others who have kind of become classics in the genre, how is the discussion on Isma positioned in the literature on the Khasa'is?
Well, thank you. The question is it is really technical, extremely technical, because As-Suyuti, let's focus on just one author because we cannot deal with many other. As-Suyuti in the Khasa'is al-Kubra makes a distinction about the extension of Isma first. So Muhammad was forgiven ما تقدم وما تأخر, everything. Moses was forgiven everything after he got prophethood, and so on. The main figure in this case are Moses and Ibrahim. Ibrahim was, I do not remember to admit, if he was forgiven everything happening after the sacrifice or after building the Kaaba. So, but he was forgiven for previous sins. But no, it is different. Sorry. It was forgiven all major sins, then minor sins that may have occurred during his lives were absorbed, but not forgiven. So it's just like they will be forgiven by the Shafa'ah of Muhammad at the end of times, which is the main point As-Suyuti makes on Isma. he couples them, and Al-Qastellani in Mawahib al-Laduniya follows him. And the commentary of Zurkani on this point is some 60 pages of commentary on this single point, because it is essential. It is not that they were not forgiven. Isma is of all the prophet, but some of them were prevented from doing wrong, which is Moses after the revelation. Some of them were forgiven, but anyway, all of them will be forgiven, but only because of the Shafa'ah of the prophet. Sorry if I mix it up, but I had to wrap up something I read some time ago.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Janita Kardic from Berlin, and a former fellow here in Tübingen. Janita, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Petrone, for this really excellent talk. Thank you, Ruggero. Thank you, Besnik, for organizing this lecture series. I was wondering, how do you draw the line between Sufi and non-Sufi discourses in relation to the Khasais? Like, is there a crucial defining moment or characteristic which kind of defines something which is, belonging to a Sufi or a non-Sufi discourse? So that's one question. And do you happen to know what happens with the Khasais genre in the Ottoman period?
So the first thing is not simple, but it's simpler than the second one. The first thing is the distinction I've made is pretty functional, meaning that the author that I identified as non-Sufis in their biographies have no Sufi master, have not shown any attachment to any Sufi order. We don't know of them of any text dealing with Sufi, with a Sufi approach, meaning or metaphysical or even practical, like biographies of Sufis or whatever. So this was pretty functional, just to draw a line, which is a blurred one, of course, because saying that, well, As-Suyuti was a Sufi. Yes, he wrote a work on the Shadiliya, but despite the effort made in the last period, there was a conference in Venice a few years ago about As-Suyuti organized by the School of Mamluk Studies there, and we discussed a lot about was he a Sufi or not. Well, As-Suyuti embodies this kind of contradictions. He had no Sufi master, but he claimed to have seen the Prophet while awake some 70 times. He wrote a work on the Shadiliya, but Shadilis do not, most Egyptian Shadilis do not recognize him as a Shadili. So the line is blurred inside the very same figures. So the line I try to draw is purely functional. It's not something that you would say, yes, okay, he was a Sufi, he was not. But, and this is the main point of my presentation, of my approach in general, distinguishing between Sufi and not Sufi. Does it really make sense from a certain point onwards, maybe 13th, 14th century, depending on the eras? Does it really make sense? Sufism was practically everywhere. So it is impossible to avoid any form of confrontation. The other part of this functional distinction is how they earned a living. So As-Sakhawi, well, he was a Sufi, but he was mainly a historian, a muhaddith, muhtasib of the market. So he did not earn a living as a Sufi master. It was not Al-Jazuli, it was not Al-Busiri, who lived in Zawiya. Well, they had wives, they had children, but they were part of Sufi in the institutionalization process of Sufism. The As-Sakhawi or As-Suyuti or even Ibn Bashkwal, no, they were not. But for sure, Ibn Bashkwal met Ibn Barajan, the famous and controversial somehow Andalusi Sufi. They shared some students, possibly Maribel Fierro, possibly they exchanged some letters. So it is really difficult to say, was this Sufi or not? in the Ottoman period, this is a complicated question because it depends on first where in the Ottoman period. Because starting from the 16th century, we see the use of Persian language, but I have not detected in Persian language in the Ottoman lands anything doing with khasais, but I still have to do this.